1,142 hours. The Black Sea. The USS Porter was 3 hours into a routine freedom of navigation transit when the AN/SPY-1 radar's processing architecture flagged a contact that had departed Anapa Air Base in southern Russia 40 minutes earlier. Not a contact that had just appeared. A contact that the system had been tracking since wheels up, cross-referenced against flight path projections, and quietly categorized according to the specific parameters that distinguished a Tu-22M 3-backfire supersonic maritime strike bomber from the routine military air traffic that transited the Black Sea region daily. The backfire is a 124-ton swept-wing aircraft designed specifically to sink warships. It carries the KH-22 anti-ship missile, a weapon with a 350-kilometer range and a terminal dive profile at Mach 4.6, coming down nearly vertically onto a target's deck. When a Tu-22M3 departs a base that houses a Black Sea Fleet strike regiment at the precise moment a U.S. destroyer enters the sea, and when its flight path projects to an intercept with that destroyer's position, the calculation is straightforward. This aircraft was not on a training route. What the backfire's crew had been sent to accomplish was something subtler than an attack. They were on a collection mission, and the thing they wanted to collect was a frequency. To understand why that frequency matters, you need to understand the difference between a warship's search radar and its fire control radar. The AN/SPY-1, in its normal operating mode, broadcasts a wide-beam rotating scan across a full 360 degrees. It is a surveillance instrument, sweeping continuously, optimized to detect and track contacts across a large volume of airspace and ocean surface simultaneously. The fire control radar is a fundamentally different system. It focuses a narrow, high-power beam on a specific target, broadcasting the precise frequency signature and algorithmic pattern required to guide a weapon to impact. That frequency is treated as among the most sensitive technical secrets a warship carries, because a nation that knows it can build jammers or decoys specifically tuned to interfere with it. You cannot obtain that frequency from satellite intelligence or from a radar intercept station ashore. You can only obtain it by getting close enough to a U.S. warship, in circumstances threatening enough that the crew activates the system in a defensive posture and recording what comes out of their emitters. The backfire's profile, descending to low altitude, flying a wave-skimming approach that used sea clutter to create interference on surface search radar, was the scenario designed to achieve exactly that. A 124-ton supersonic bomber, diving toward a destroyer at 500 feet above the water, closing at near supersonic speed, is the kind of threat stimulus that activates defensive fire control instinctively. The Russian assumption was that the combination of visual threat and radar noise would push the Porter's crew to flip from passive tracking to active fire control mode within seconds of detection. The Porter's captain had seen this playbook before. The AN/SPY-1 had been tracking the backfire since it was over 100 miles out. Not in fire control mode, in standard search mode, which the system's signal processing architecture had already refined to filter out the sea clutter the backfire was trying to hide behind. The noise cancellation algorithms that the Russian crew was counting on to mask their approach had been accounted for in the system's design parameters. The contact was being tracked with the same quiet precision as every other object in the radar's coverage envelope. The ship said nothing, activated nothing, changed nothing about its electronic emission profile. It simply continued its transit and waited. If you have ever sat through a long negotiation knowing information the other side doesn't know you have, knowing their position, knowing their timeline, knowing exactly how much pressure they're actually under while they project confidence, you understand the specific quality of calm the Porter's bridge maintained in those minutes. The backfire crew was looking down at a ship that appeared to be ignoring them. They interpreted that as either fear or obliviousness. It was neither. It was the patience of people who had already won the informational contest and were watching the other side spend effort on a move that had been countered before it began. The backfire made its pass. Supersonic at 500 feet, the pressure wave from its engine exhaust measurable through the hull as it crossed the mast line. The radar warning receiver aboard the Russian aircraft registered nothing. No fire control emission, no missile guidance signal, no indication that the American ship had responded in the way the mission required. The pilot pulled up and began positioning for a second approach. It was at this moment that the Porter's radar picture added a second contact. And Su-30SM flanker multi-role fighter had been tracking the engagement from altitude. maintaining a position that placed it outside the detection range of any radar the porter had been broadcasting, which, because the ship had been operating entirely in passive mode, meant it was operating with the confidence of a surveillance platform that believed itself undetected. The Su-30's role was the collection mission's insurance policy. If the porter activated its fire control radar in response to the backfire, the flanker's reconnaissance systems would capture the emission from an angle and altitude that provided the clearest possible signal. If the backfire drew a defensive response, the flanker harvested the data. If the backfire didn't, the flanker's presence could escalate the pressure. The porter's captain had a second problem on his screen, and it was a more sophisticated one because the flanker had not done anything that constituted provocation. It was simply present, watching, offering its crew the option of recording whatever the American ship did next. Shooting at it would be an act of war. Ignoring it meant accepting continued surveillance. Confronting it with fighters would reveal the American response network. 100 kilometers away, 2 F-15C Eagles had been airborne from a Romanian base for longer than the backfire had been in the air. They had not been scrambled in response to the Russian provocation. They had launched before the backfire left Anapa, based on the same early warning satellite detection that had given NATO's tracking network the initial alert, and had spent the intervening time climbing to altitude, flying a wide arc that kept them beyond Russian radar detection range, and operating entirely on navigation data fed through the Link 16 network. No active radar, no emission that any Russian sensor could have detected. They were, from the Russian perspective, not there. Link 16, NATO's encrypted real-time tactical data-sharing network, had been distributing the porter's track data on the backfire from the moment of first detection. The F-15 pilots had the backfire's speed, altitude, heading, engine thrust variation rate, and projected flight path on their displays throughout the entire intercept. They had been flying a solution to the encounter while the backfire crew was still planning its second approach, using information collected by a ship's radar 400 kilometers away from their current position. As the backfire pulled up from its first pass and banked to set up a second run, the most aerodynamically committed moment in its approach, when the aircraft's options were most constrained by physics, the 2 F-15Cs descended from 10,000 feet and inserted themselves into the airspace directly ahead of the Russian aircraft's projected flight path. They did not lock on. They did not activate weapons systems. They occupied space. At 500 feet of altitude with limited airspeed from the dive recovery, the backfire pilot's maneuvering options were substantially constrained by the energy state his aircraft was in. 2 fighters with air-to-air missiles clearly visible on their wings, positioned on a geometry that made his next planned course impossible without collision, communicated the situation without a word being necessary. He could not descend. The water was below him. He could not accelerate into them. The geometry didn't permit it. He could not turn sharply. His energy state didn't support it. The Su-30 that had been providing overwatch and that had been positioned to record any fire control emission from the porter registered the 2 Eagles and quietly altered its course. The aircraft, whose mission was to support the backfire and collect American radar data, had decided that the situation no longer warranted staying. On the International Guard frequency, the backfire crew transmitted the expected formulation, identification as a Russian Air Force aircraft operating legally in international airspace. The F-15 element responded with 4 words: maintain safe distance. No accusation, no warning, no threat. The instruction that a traffic controller gives to 2 aircraft that are operating too close to each other, a phrasing so neutral it could not be cited as a provocation, could not be recorded as a threat, could not be used for anything in the subsequent press statement that the Kremlin would issue, claiming the operation had been a success. The backfire opened its bomb bay briefly. The standard gesture that demonstrates an aircraft is carrying ordnance and is capable of using it, the aerial equivalent of showing a weapon without raising it. Then it closed the bay, banked toward Crimea, and began its return transit with 2 F-15Cs maintaining escort position until it cleared NATO's air defense identification zone. The porter continued its transit. No fire control radar had been activated. No frequency had been recorded. The backfire crew had burned fuel, accepted the personal risk of supersonic low-altitude flight over open water, and submitted to a 2-fighter escort back to their own airspace without achieving any of the collection objectives the mission had been designed to accomplish. The accounting from the Russian side, 1 operational sortie expended, fuel and maintenance costs for a backfire and an Su-30, and the exposure of the double coverage tactic. the backfire as the visible provocation, the flanker as the shadow collector, to NATO analysis. Every parameter of the backfire's flight profile, the Su-30's positioning geometry, and the timing relationship between the two aircraft had been recorded by the Porter's tracking systems and distributed across the Link 16 network throughout the engagement. The collection mission had reversed itself. Russia had sent an aircraft to collect American frequency data and instead provided NATO with a detailed operational profile of how the tactic is coordinated between a strike aircraft and an accompanying reconnaissance platform. From the American side, 2 F-15Cs consumed fuel. The Porter's crew had coffee. The AN/SPY-1 continued its normal operational cycle. The restraint that defined the American response was not passivity. It was a more sophisticated form of engagement than any weapon system could have provided. Activating fire control radar would have given Russia the frequency it came for. Shooting down the backfire would have generated a political situation in which the United States, not Russia, was explaining an unprovoked attack on a military aircraft in international airspace. Scrambling fighters visibly from the moment of first detection would have revealed the response network's architecture before the F-15S had achieved the positional advantage their late, silent approach provided. By doing nothing observable until the moment it was strategically optimal to act, the Porter's crew turned the Russian provocation into a demonstration of exactly the capability Russia was trying to assess. The AN/SPY-1 tracks targets over 100 miles out in passive mode without revealing its operational status. The Link 16 network distributes that track data to allied assets who can respond without broadcasting their existence. Fighters can be positioned on a geometry that closes options rather than escalating them, using data from a ship they were never close to. And all of this happens while the ship's crew maintains an outward profile of complete indifference. The backfire pilot had looked down at a ship that appeared to be ignoring him and concluded that his approach was working. He was watching the wrong metric. The ship that looks unbothered in the presence of a 124-ton bomber doing low passes over its mast is not a ship that is afraid. It is a ship that has already decided how the encounter ends, is waiting for the right moment to demonstrate that decision, and has no need to activate anything until it does. This is the strategic logic that makes restraint in these encounters its own form of power projection. Every adversary that attempts a threshold-testing provocation against a U.S. naval asset is simultaneously providing the network with a detailed operational profile of how they conduct that provocation, what platform they use, what altitude and speed profile they fly, what support assets they position, and where, how those assets communicate, and how they respond when their plan encounters resistance. That intelligence accumulates. It is the raw material from which the next countermeasure is built. The Black Sea engagement did not end with a missile. It ended with 4 words on an international radio frequency and 2 fighters escorting a bomber back to its own airspace. For the crew of the Porter, it was an unremarkable morning. For the analysts processing the encounter data afterward, it was a productive one. Here is the question worth considering. If the 2 F-15Cs had not been pre-positioned, if the backfire had completed its second pass, come lower, and opened its bomb bay on approach rather than on departure, what is the correct order for the Porter's captain to give? Hold passive mode and accept the continued provocation, knowing that activating fire control hands Russia exactly what it came for? Or authorize a defensive response that ends the immediate threat and begins a different kind of problem? There is no clean answer. The captain on the bridge of a destroyer in that moment is balancing tactical threat against strategic consequence in real time, with no room for a second opinion. What would your order be? Leave it in the comments. The most interesting command decisions in this community's discussion always come from the people who have actually held that kind of responsibility.